Okay, thank you for joining me today. I've wanted to hear your story for so long. So maybe we can begin by just giving us a short introduction of you and your family.
Yes, perfect. So, my name is Elise Rudell. I'm originally from China. I was adopted and I've been living in Montreal, Canada since I was a baby. My husband Clement is originally from France and has been living in Canada in Montreal for over 14 years. And our little boy, Malo, turned 4 last March, so we're still living in Montreal at the moment.
And so I think your international background is what drew me to your story because, like you, I come from an international family as well. So it's very nice to meet you. What was one of the first warning signs you remember seeing?
So, I worked and studied in special education, and so I had the agency of working with children and babies in their first years of my career. So, I was familiar with normal child development, so to speak. And I discovered very early on that my lot had a slower than normal development. That is to say, from the first few months, the very first 2 months, I found that his head wasn't holding up well. When I put him on the wind, he was very, very irritable. He didn't want to hold his head up, and that was a lot when he was drinking his milk. When he was a baby, lack of tone, very irritable. The nights from birth were very, very difficult, and it was really from the 4th month onward that, for the first time, my lad had an oculogyric crisis. So his eyes rolled in the back of his head. It was only for a few seconds, and I didn't see my partner when it happened, but I thought it was something alarming. And then, a few months later, at around 6 months, his tone was still very slow. We started doing physio at the Montreal Children's Hospital, and I also found out that his arms were very stiff and his points were always closed. So that's what started to alert me personally, and his father less than me, let's say.
So in the beginning, were there moments that you felt like you were being overly cautious or paranoid, like, oh, this is nothing? Or in the beginning, did you think this is something serious?
For me, I always found it very worrying. I never thought I was paranoid or anything. On the other hand, people around me used to tell me that all children develop at different speeds. I had to give him time, which was perhaps a little slower than others. So, for sure, I didn't have the support, and I was really the only one around telling me something was wrong. So it was all the more difficult because I didn't feel very supported at the time, but I always knew there was something wrong. And that's why, personally, I was the one who pushed him to investigate to find out what was wrong.
And what words did you use to describe the symptoms of AADC opposed to what the doctors may have said? What were the descriptions that you were trying to communicate to the specialist that they were having a hard time pinpointing the actual symptoms?
So, for the symptoms we'd begun to notice in Malo, it was mainly his hypotonia, the closed stitches, the redness in his arms in the evening. And then for the mild oculogenic crisis seizures, Malo was said to be rolling his eyes. It started mainly in the evening and to the left, and we didn't know, so the doctors immediately suspected epilepsy. And when they realized the epilepsy tests were not positive, we went to see an optometrist because they didn't understand what was going on with his eyes. And we were lucky enough to find on the Rare Diseases of the World website the mother of another child who had the disease to death, who described the same symptoms as Malo. She called them oculogyric crisis seizures. And that's why we were able to give the name oculogenic crisis seizures to the doctors who were part of the team trying to find Malo's disease at the time, because we really felt that the little boy's symptoms of this rare disease resembled those of Malo. And she had also said on this rare disease website that it was through a lumbar puncture that they had found the disease. And in the end, it was also a lumbar puncture that led to Malo's diagnosis, even if it was only after several tests that they agreed to do it. So, yes, we were able to quickly find the right words because my husband and I had done a lot of research on the internet to help the doctors find out what Malo had.
And was your son Malo ever misdiagnosed?
No, fortunately, he wasn't misdiagnosed. We did have a lot of studies, though, to find the disease. So it was MRI, ESG to see if he had epilepsy, genetic tests. So, a lot. A whole week of intensive testing. We had to change doctors 4 times before we found someone willing to do the assessments on Malo because, again, nobody believed there was anything wrong with him. So I had to push and push. And it was finally after 4, having seen 4 different pediatricians in less than 6 months, that the last pediatrician saw that something was wrong and decided to hospitalize him to do the test. But yes, we immediately found the right diagnosis for Malo after several months of research.
And how did you know you needed to continue to persist for an accurate diagnosis or that you couldn't wait any longer?
Given that Malo's symptoms were quite severe, quite intense, quite disturbing for him, I thought it might be serious. It's not very often that you see a child who rolls his eyes, who has rigidity in his limbs. I looked a lot on the internet and couldn't find any other illnesses that matched Malo's symptoms. It was very difficult for me to know if it was dangerous for him. I really wanted to find out what he'd broken through to as quickly as possible because I didn't know if it was a degenerative disease or if he could have after effects if he wasn't treated as quickly as possible. That's why I pushed for the investigations to be carried out as quickly as possible because I was afraid for his life.
And how frustrating was it for you going through different medications?
It was both frustrating and not frustrating because I knew once we'd been diagnosed, I knew that it was a very rare disease. And at that point in time, we still had a pretty close knit team at the hospital where Malo was being followed and that they were trying to do the best they could. On the other hand, it was frustrating in the sense that thanks to the AADC, Moms and Dads group on Facebook, I had the chance to see all the drug trials carried out by parents on their children. So at a certain point, I felt I knew more than the doctors following Malo who didn't know anything about the disease. So the first neurologist who followed us started giving Malo dopamine agonists, but told us to give them only in the evening. And I'd been reading from the start that he should be given 3 times a day and should avoid giving it in the evening as it could worsen his disorders. And that's why it was so frustrating. I even had to change neurologists because she insisted on being given only in the evening and we could see that it was getting worse. So I said to myself that it wasn't a good match for us with that doctor. So on many levels, I also felt that I wanted to give advice myself to the doctors who were prescribing us medication because of everything I had learned through the Facebook group at that time.
And how long was your journey when you saw the first symptom until you finally learned that Malo had AADC?
The first symptoms were around 3 months for me, and we received the diagnosis a little over a year later, the official diagnosis. However, there were some clues. We started to get clues at around 11 months of a neurotransmitter disease. We started taking L-Dopa, but Malo didn't respond, so we stopped only 4 months later, around 13 months, when we got the right diagnosis. So I'll go a year between the first symptoms and the official diagnosis.
And then once you learned that Malo had AADC, how did you feel when you learned that there was no treatment option available, at least, through the hospitals?
So, when we learned of the diagnosis, we'd already been in hospital for several weeks, and to pass the time and avoid being too depressed, Malo's father and I decided to do a lot of research on the disease on the internet. So, we spent all our days, all our nights when we had a moment when Malo was asleep, browsing all the internet sites that talked about the disease, all the forums. We read everything on the parents group, even in previous years, because we told ourselves we wanted to know everything about the disease and what was possible for Malo. We saw that there were drugs that could help the disease, but that few children responded to the medication or that it worked very little on most children. So we were hopeful that the medication would work, and very quickly on the internet, we saw that there was a gene therapy that was starting that had begun clinical trials a few years earlier. So we were aware of the possibilities fairly quickly, but it's clear that when we were diagnosed, knowing that it wasn't an already degenerative disease, even if the children could die with fairly severe symptoms, was a relief.
And how did you first hear about gene therapy?
We read about gene therapy on the internet. We read about it. But I was the first to see it on the mom and dad's group. In fact, I joined the group before Malo was diagnosed because I suspected that this was the disease he had. So I read that some parents were talking about genetic therapy, and I saw that some children had had genetic therapy and that it had had very positive results on children who were more severe. Then, of course, afterwards, I went on the internet myself to find out more, and I spoke about it myself to the doctor who was treating Malo.
And continuing on gene therapy, can you give us your honest thoughts about what you think of gene therapy and maybe what your concerns are about this treatment?
Yes, so I've been reading about gene therapy since Malo was diagnosed, so for more than 3 years. For us, it's been a bit complicated because Malo is one of the children with a less severe phenotype. So, for children with a more severe phenotype, it was clear to me that gene therapy was the right thing to do, that it would save their lives, that it would allow them to have fewer symptoms, to suffer less, to have better life expectancy. But for us, it was more difficult because Malo is less severe. We wondered what gene therapy could do for him. We wondered if he would be eligible for gene therapy. And as no other child of his phenotype had ever had surgery, it was very difficult for us to know if it would be best for him. Since our doctors here knew nothing about gene therapy, they knew very little about the disease. It was me and his father who decided to contact doctors all over the world to get their opinions. I also asked you once for Doctor Who's contact in Taiwan to ask his opinion. We also contacted Mita Bertolou, in Europe. We contacted the French team. We also contacted the PTC team who have started gene therapy clinical trials all over the United States. We contacted doctors in Boston, Texas, France, and Asia to find out what they thought of Malo's therapy. In general, they thought it was a wonderful therapy and that we were very lucky for the severe disease to have two kinds of therapy. For us, the process was a little more complicated because we didn't know what was the best choice for Malo, and all the doctors just about everywhere told us the same thing, that there could be no guarantee for Malo because no other patient as moderate as Malo had ever been treated before.
And you recently started a GoFundMe. Do you mind telling us a little bit about your GoFundMe account?
Yes, so finally, after the 3-year wait, we were accepted for venous therapy. So we had two contacts. We had a contact in France, since Malo's father is French, so Malo has French nationality, who was offering the same therapy as PTC, i.e. Putamen, which was a therapy that if you didn't get Social Security acceptance, that we were going to have to pay ourselves. So it was quite a complicated process, and at the same time we were on the waiting list for gene therapy in Ohio, in Columbus, with Bankowitz's team in Midbrain. And we still don't have a date, but Malo should be next on the list for surgery. When we heard that Malo was going to have the operation, we thought about a GoFundMe because we thought that financially it was going to be difficult for the family, since we have no money to spare because when Malo was diagnosed during the pandemic, I had to stop working for 2.5 years. Because no daycare would accept Malo due to his symptoms, and because Malo had to sleep every 2 hours to avoid oculogyric seizures. So the first 2 years of his life, it was mainly a case of trying to get him to sleep. To stay at home in light that wasn't too bright because that created oculogenic crisis seizures. So for the first 2 years, I didn't work, so we lived on a salary. And then we found a multi-disabled daycare center that opened in Montreal, which is, I think, the first multi-disabled daycare center in Canada. And they accepted Malo. So Malo was the first child to be able to join the daycare, and that meant I could start working part-time again. Because Malo still had to have a nap in the morning from too much sun at night, and they wouldn't do the daycare. So I worked a few hours a day for the first few months. Then I had to stop working because Malo was getting sick all the time, and hospitalizations were becoming more and more frequent. So for the first few years of his life, as soon as he caught a virus, we were hospitalized. There were these 2 bouts of pneumonia last year that meant I had to go away really, really a lot, and I didn't do much work. And with the gene therapy, my husband and I will have to stop working for a few months, and we'd like to keep our apartment and Malo's place in a non-subsidized daycare center. So it's a daycare that costs $1,450 a month, which isn't reimbursable. So all the expenses we have to make for our apartment, the daycare, Malo's medication as well. Malo started a medication a few months ago, a sleep medication that's being sold in France and Europe right now that we're bringing in, and it's costing us over $340 a month. So we had stopped taking this medication because of the cost. And now, thanks to the GoFundMe, we're able to take it again. So it's for a number of reasons and for the continuation of Malo's treatment that we decided to get help from a GoFundMe.
Thank you for sharing that. If you were to meet a new family just beginning stages of identifying AADC, what advice would you give them?
I'll tell him not to be discouraged because when I was diagnosed, I was very encouraged to join the Facebook group with all the parents and the others who gave me so much advice when I was diagnosed. It helped me enormously to know what to do, to know how to manage all the symptoms of Malo, to have moral support, to know more about medication, about treatments that might be available for the disease. So that would be to join that group. I also think that getting informed about the disease really helps because I've also talked to parents who were diagnosed at one point and didn't know about gene therapy and medications. And I think the more informed you are, the more you can help your doctors, no matter where you live, to try to find the best treatment for your child because it's a very rare disease. Doctors and their understanding staff know very little about the disease and often don't know what is the best treatment for a child. So it's important to get informed, to push for treatments, and to try to convince the medical team behind you what's best for your child. Because I've often asked to change my child's medications myself. So yes, it's important to find out what's going on and then really push for the best treatment for your child.
And AADC, like many rare diseases, have parents searching for a diagnosis. What advice would you give to parents searching for a diagnosis?
I think in my case, it was necessary to encourage the doctors to continue with the examinations because we did a lot of them. We felt the doctors were getting discouraged because they couldn't find anything. So we really encouraged them to do other tests and to ask other doctors for help too. We asked if Malo's case could be seen by the hospital's neurology team, given that the neurologist assigned to us couldn't find him. So it was another neurologist on the team who perhaps thought that Malo was suffering from muscle arrest dystonia, who immediately thought of a metabolic disease. So if the doctor assigned to you doesn't know, perhaps to ask for help from a team. We also searched extensively on the internet. It was thanks to this that we were able to see another little boy who had the same illness as Malo, and it was we ourselves who told the team about oculogyrate crisis seizures and lumbar function. It was thanks to this that we were able to see another little boy who had the same illness as Malo, and it was we ourselves who told the team about oculogyrate crisis seizures and lumbar function. At first, he didn't think it was that, but we sent the articles, I showed videos of the group and SIMOMs and aides to our neurologist to show that Malo's seizures resembled the oculogyrate crisis seizures of these children who weren't necessarily epileptic either. So once again, it would be to push for full examinations to be done, to make sure that all possible genetic tests are done to get the right treatment because yes, there are children who have the disease who have been misdiagnosed and who have to take the wrong medication for years. So that would be asking around. For us, it was really finding out on the internet that it was a disease. That's what allowed us to learn the most and even help our doctors to find Malo's disease.
And thinking about your journey, is there anything that you wish doctors would have done differently?
Yes, doctors in general. Since Malo was born, we've had a feeling of love-hate towards medicine. We've changed a lot of doctors, so there have been 4 pediatricians since he was born. 3 pediatricians who never believed me about Malo's early symptoms, who told me he might have a slower development, who didn't see Malo's oculogyrate crisis with their own eyes, who didn't believe me. It was myself. By sending messages on social networks through contact that I was able to find a wonderful pediatrician who was able to take care of Malo, and it was the first time that someone believed me in more than 8 months. and believe me on the fact that yes, she also thought Malo had an illness. It's about not giving up. If you're told your child has nothing and you're convinced he has something, it's to listen to that moment there. I think when a parent senses something in their child, it's often something. If I'd been discouraged when the first or second doctor told me that Malo was fine, I don't think we have gotten the diagnosis so early. I also think that when your child has a rare disease and the doctors know little about it, it's also the parent's duty to do research to help medicine, to help find solutions. In our case, it was really us who pushed for it. I can say that it's thanks to us that we're using gene therapy. Because if we'd had to wait for the doctors around us to find out about it, I don't think Malo would have been able to receive it today.
Thank you. And just one last question. For organizations like Teach Rare or organizations that help patients and their families, is there any advice you can give to us on how we can better help families and parents that have children with rare diseases?
I think that for this kind of thing, Facebook groups are really great because you can talk to parents who have children with the same disease, especially when there's little information on these diseases on the internet. No one has better advice than parents who live with children with these symptoms on a daily basis. Me, I just remember for Malo symptoms, if only for oculogenic crisis seizures, what to do, what they create oculogenic crisis seizures, how I can avoid them, and what can I do when they happen. I'd seen on the Facebook group that a mom saying that her child's oculogenic crisis seizures calmed down with the screens. And now, when Malo has an oculogenic crisis seizure, we put him in front of the screens all the time. So groups like that, with parents who have children with these rare diseases, are really the best advice. Otherwise, yes, I think it's mainly support groups, internet groups that talk about the disease that help parents in general.
Thank you so much for taking the time to share your story and uh, giving us all the information that you have. It's going to be helpful for so many families. So thank you for giving us that.
Thank you. Also, for any other questions, parents can also write to me privately on the group. It's a pleasure to answer.
All right, thank you. And say hello to your husband and, of course, to Malo for me.
Yes. Thank you, Richard. Bye bye.